The grand hall shimmered with a golden light, shining upon the polished marble floors, which gleamed like mirrors. Diplomats and pack leaders filled every corner, their voices a low hum of power and politics, each word weighted with centuries of tradition and territorial pride. Silk banners bearing ancient pack symbols hung from vaulted ceilings, their colors rich as jewels against stone walls that had witnessed countless coronations, battles, and treaties. At the center of it all stood Círdan Ashcreston, the Alpha King, commanding attention without effort. His black hair fell past his shoulders like a raven's wing, his beard sharply trimmed to emphasize a jawline that could have been carved from granite. His muscular frame, built through years of combat and training, was draped in ceremonial silks the color of midnight, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with every movement. The fabric spoke of authority, earned through blood and strategy, of a young king who'd claimed his throne at 23 and never looked back. He was speaking with the elder council when the massive oak doors opened once more, their hinges groaning with the weight of centuries. The room continued its rhythm for exactly 3 seconds, conversations flowing, wine being poured, the string quartet in the corner maintaining their melodic background. Then silence fell like a curtain dropping, absolute and stunning. Every head turned, every conversation died mid-sentence, words trailing off into stunned quiet. Even the musicians faltered, their instruments trailing into silence as bows froze mid-stroke and fingers stilled on strings. The very air seemed to hold its breath, candle flames standing perfectly still, as though the universe itself had paused to witness this moment. Phaneira Silverbond stood at the threshold. She wore a dress the color of deep wine, a shade that existed somewhere between burgundy and blood, velvet that caught the light and held it like a living thing. The fabric fell in graceful folds from her shoulders to the floor, simple in design but exquisite in execution, clearly the work of a master seamstress who understood that true beauty needed no embellishment. Her white hair, usually bound for work, now cascaded over pale shoulders like a waterfall of moonlight, the strands so pure they seemed to glow against her alabaster skin. Each lock had been carefully arranged to frame a face that carried both gentleness and quiet strength, delicate features that somehow suggested steel beneath porcelain. Around her neck rested a silver pendant, simple yet ancient, the kind of jewelry that whispered of generations and secrets. The symbol etched into its surface was unfamiliar to most who saw it, geometric patterns that predated current heraldry, but it caught the glow of 1,000 candles and threw back light like captured stars. She took one step forward, then another, her movements measured despite the weight of hundreds of stairs. Her eyes, pale blue like winter ice, scanned the crowd briefly before finding Círdan's across the impossible distance. In that gaze, he saw uncertainty warring with determination, fear balanced by courage and something else, something that made his heart clench behind his ribs. Recognition, as though she'd been looking for him her whole life and only just realized it. He had invited her as a joke. At least, that's what his friends had assumed when he'd announced it 3 days prior, dropping the information casually over war strategy maps and expensive whiskey. The laughter had been loud, the teasing merciless, echoing off the walls of his private chambers where his inner circle gathered. The great Círdan Ashcreston, Lord Varen had wheezed between guffaws. Ruler of 2 territories, commander of 3 armies, inviting a servant girl to the most important diplomatic event of the season. "Is this your way of telling us you've given up on finding a proper Luna?" another had asked, grinning. "Should we send our condolences to all those noble houses that have been parading their daughters before you?" "Perhaps he's making a statement," suggested Bellingham, his war advisor, "showing he won't be pressured into political marriages." Círdan had let them laugh, had even smiled along with their assumptions. Surely it was a jest, a moment of rebellion against the endless pressure to choose a Luna from the noble houses constantly parading their daughters before him. Every week brought new introductions, new attempts to secure alliances through marriage, knew women who looked at his crown before they looked at his face. But later, when they'd all departed and he stood alone on his balcony overlooking the kingdom sprawled below, the stars sharp as knife points in the cold night air, he'd known the truth with crystalline clarity. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube. Extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. It had started 2 months ago, though perhaps the seeds had been planted long before that. He'd been returning from the training grounds at dawn, exhausted and sweat-soaked, when he'd heard singing. The voice had been soft, barely audible over the morning birdsong, but pure as rain. He'd followed it to a corridor where servants were beginning their morning duties, and there she'd been. Phaneira. He hadn't known her name then. She'd been scrubbing floors, her white hair tied back carelessly, her dress simple and worn. But she'd been singing, some old ballad he half remembered from childhood, and there'd been joy in her voice despite the menial labor. She'd looked up, seen him watching, and her cheeks had flushed with embarrassment. But she hadn't trembled or cowered like so many did in his presence. She'd simply smiled, apologized softly for disturbing him, and returned to her work. He'd found himself seeking out her voice after that, taking roots through the castle that coincidentally passed where she worked. He'd watched her comfort a crying child who'd gotten lost, had seen her defend a younger servant from a cruel steward, had noticed the way she treated everyone with the same gentle dignity regardless of their rank. And 3 nights ago, drunk on whiskey and tired of pretending, he'd made his decision. He would invite her, not as a joke, not as rebellion, but because somewhere in the past 2 months, the bright spot in his day had become catching glimpses of her, and he wanted to know if she felt even a fraction of what he did. But standing there, watching her walk through that sea of stunned faces, seeing her chin lift with quiet defiance, even as her hands trembled slightly at her sides, Círdan knew the truth with crystalline clarity. This was no joke. This had never been a joke. The memory of that conversation, just 2 days ago, burned bright in his mind. He'd summoned her to his private study, a room she'd cleaned 100 times but never entered while he was present. She'd arrived precisely on time, her servant's dress crisp despite its obvious age, her white hair neatly braided. She'd curtsied perfectly, eyes downcast, every inch the proper servant. "You asked to see me, Your Majesty?" Her voice had been steady, but he'd heard the undercurrent of worry. Servants were only summoned to the king's private chambers for 2 reasons: exceptional service or terrible mistakes. She'd been mentally cataloging which it might be. "Sit," he'd said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She'd hesitated, clearly confused. Servants didn't sit in the king's presence. "Your Majesty, I can stand. It's no trouble." It wasn't a request. She'd sat then, perched on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to take flight, her hands folded precisely in her lap. The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows had turned her hair to spun silver. "Have I done something wrong, Your Majesty?" she'd asked when the silence stretched. "No, the opposite, actually." He'd leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "I have a question for you, Phaneira." Her eyes had widened slightly. He'd used her name. He'd learned it weeks ago, asked the head housekeeper casually one morning. But this was the first time he'd spoken it aloud to her. "Of course, Your Majesty. The diplomatic banquet, 2 nights from now. I would like you to attend as my guest." The color had drained from her face. For a moment, he'd thought she might faint. Her hands gripped the armrests of the chair, knuckles going white. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I must have misheard. You want me to attend the banquet?" "As my companion for the evening, yes. But I'm a servant. I clean floors and change linens. I don't belong at royal functions. Surely this is some kind of test or punishment?" Her voice had risen slightly, panic creeping in. He'd stood then, moving around the desk to crouch before her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. It had been forward, improper, but he'd needed her to see his sincerity. "Look at me," he'd said softly. She'd met his eyes, and he'd seen a dozen emotions warring in her gaze. Confusion, fear, and underneath it all, something that looked almost like hope. "This is not a test or punishment. I'm inviting you because I want you there. Because in a room full of nobility and politics and careful masks, you're the only person I can think of who would be genuine, who wouldn't see a crown when you looked at me." "What would I see?" she'd whispered. "I'm hoping you'll tell me that. After the banquet. After you've had time to decide if you can tolerate my company for an evening." She'd stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for mockery or ulterior motives. Whatever she'd found there had satisfied something, because slowly, hesitantly, she'd nodded. "I don't have anything appropriate to wear. That's already been handled. A dressmaker will come to your quarters this evening with options. Choose whichever you like. The other servants will talk. The nobles will judge. This could cause you political problems. Let them talk. Let them judge. I've faced down armies. I can handle gossip." A small smile had tugged at her lips then, the first real expression beyond fear and confusion. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Your Majesty. Can't I be both?" That had earned him a soft laugh, and the sound had been worth every complication this decision would bring. Now, watching her navigate the gauntlet of stares and whispers with her head held high, he felt that same certainty. Whatever came of this night, whatever consequences arose, it would be worth it to see her standing in this room, refusing to be diminished by those who thought themselves her betters. Phaneira reached him, her cheeks touched with the faintest color, her breathing careful and controlled despite the walk that must have felt like crossing a battlefield. She curtsied, the gesture both proper and somehow mocking the formality of it all, as though she knew the absurdity of servant protocols in this moment. "Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice carrying despite its quietness. "Phaneira." His voice came out rougher than intended, emotion tightening his throat. He extended his hand, and when she placed hers in his palm, something electric passed between them, a spark that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with recognition. The whispers started immediately, spreading like wildfire through the assembled crowd. But Círdan didn't care. He led her to the high table, seating her at his right hand, the position traditionally reserved for his most honored guest, for visiting royalty or crucial allies. The message was clear, and it sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. Elder Emiorn Zelorn, seated 3 places down, leaned forward slightly, his ancient eyes fixed on the pendant at Phaneira's throat. His weathered face, marked by 7 decades of leadership and wisdom, showed a flicker of something intense. His gnarled fingers gripped his wine glass tighter, knuckles whitening. He said nothing, but his gaze never wavered from that silver symbol, his mind clearly working through some puzzle only he could see. The banquet proceeded with forced normalcy. Servants brought course after course, each dish a masterpiece of culinary art that Phaneira barely touched. Conversations resumed, though stilted now, everyone acutely aware of the young woman in a dress worth more than she earned in a year, sitting beside their king. The questions came, some veiled in politeness, others sharp with barely concealed disdain. "Tell me, Miss Silverbond," Lady Haverna said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "What exactly do you do in the castle?" I serve, Phaneira replied simply. Cleaning, mending, whatever is needed. How humble. The word dripped with condescension. And how long have you been in service? Since I was 11, my lady. 15 years now. 15 years as a servant. Lord Thackeray, a portly man known for his vast lands and small mind, interjected. One might think you'd have aspired to more. Círdan's hand tightened on his fork, but Phaneira touched his arm lightly, a quiet signal to let her handle this. I aspired to survive, my lord, she said evenly. My mother died when I was 10, leaving me nothing but this pendant and a choice, work or starve. I chose to work. I chose to be useful. I chose dignity and labor over desperate begging. Some might call that lacking ambition. I call it practical. The table fell silent. Several nobles had the grace to look ashamed. Lady Haverna's cheeks colored, and she suddenly found her wine very interesting. Well said. Elder Emiorn spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of decades. There is nobility in honest work. My own grandmother scrubbed floors before her marriage to my grandfather. She always said it taught her the value of what others build. He raised his glass toward Phaneira. To practical wisdom. Others reluctantly joined the toast, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But Phaneira had proven something important. She wouldn't be cowed, wouldn't be made to feel lesser. She met their judgment with quiet strength, answering their questions with honesty that made their own posturing seem small. Círdan found himself watching her more than the proceedings, the way she held her wine glass, barely sipping, mindful of making a mistake. The way she listened with complete attention when others spoke, as though their words truly mattered, even when they clearly didn't deserve such courtesy. The way she didn't shrink from the weight of noble scrutiny but met it with calm dignity, her spine straight, her gaze direct. You're staring, she murmured during a lull in conversation, not looking at him, her eyes fixed on the dancers beginning to take the floor. I'm aware. People are talking. Let them. He turned to face her fully, letting the nobles see his attention was completely on her. What they say means nothing to me. She turned then, meeting his eyes fully, and he saw uncertainty warring with something warmer. Why did you really invite me? Please don't say it was about being genuine or seeing beyond your crown. I need the truth. The question hung between them, honest and brave. Círdan could have deflected, could have offered a dozen political reasons or clever evasions. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Because every other woman in this kingdom looks at me and sees a crown, a title, a means to power. You look at me and see a man. Because 3 weeks ago, I was having the worst day of my reign. A failed negotiation, a border dispute that nearly led to war, advisors questioning every decision I made. And I was walking through the castle at midnight, unable to sleep, and I heard you singing while you worked. You were cleaning the East Corridor, and you were singing this old song about stars and sailing, and you sounded happy. Genuinely happy. While scrubbing floors at midnight. He paused, gauging her reaction. She was listening intently, her lips slightly parted, her eyes wide. I stopped and listened until you finished. You turned and saw me standing there, and you did this thing. He smiled at the memory. You jumped, looked embarrassed. Then you laughed at yourself. Actually laughed. And you apologized for disturbing me, as though your singing was an inconvenience rather than the first beautiful thing I'd heard all day. And I realized I was tired of people who never laughed, who never sang, who saw every interaction as a transaction. So yes, I wanted someone genuine. But specifically, I wanted you. Phaneira stared at him, her breathing shallow, color rising in her cheeks. I remember that night, she whispered. I thought you were going to reprimand me for making noise. But you just smiled and said, "Don't stop on my account," and walked away. I couldn't sleep afterward, trying to figure out if I'd imagined the whole thing. You didn't imagine it? Clearly not. She looked around the hall, at the nobles pretending not to watch them, at the dancers swirling in elaborate patterns, at the excess and pageantry. This is madness. You know that, right? Whatever this is between us, it's politically complicated and socially impossible and I don't care. You should. You're a king. Kings don't get to not care about politics and social standing and... He took her hand under the table, threading his fingers through hers. Phaneira, I don't care. She fell silent, looking at their joined hands, then back at his face. What she saw there seemed to satisfy something because slowly, carefully, she squeezed back. You're either very brave or very foolish, she said softly, echoing her words from their earlier conversation. Can't I be both? This time her laugh was louder, and several heads turned at the sound of genuine mirth at the high table. Let them look, Cerdin thought. Let them see that their king had found something they, with all their wealth and power, couldn't buy. Joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy. The banquet ended near midnight. The final courses cleared away as guests began the elaborate ritual of departure. Lords and ladies offered their bows and curtsies, their words of gratitude carefully neutral, their eyes sharp with speculation and judgment. As they filed out in their finery, offering barely concealed glances at the young woman still seated beside their king, the weight of their stares felt almost physical. Elder Emiorn approached last, his movements slow and deliberate, each step measured as though he carried an invisible burden. His entourage of younger advisors waited at a respectful distance. When he reached the high table, his weathered face was grave, his ancient eyes locked on Phaneira, with an intensity that made Cerdin's protective instincts flare. That pendant, the elder said without preamble, his voice like wind through autumn leaves, rough with age and authority. May I ask where you acquired it? Phaneira's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, fingers finding the familiar weight of the silver pendant she'd worn every day for as long as she could remember. It was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat, the only tangible connection to a past she barely remembered. It was my mother's, she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor Cerdin could see in her hands. And her mother's before that. It's all I have of my family. My mother gave it to me days before she died, made me promise never to remove it, never to sell it no matter how hungry I got. She said it was more important than I could understand. How did your mother die, if I may ask? Fever. 15 years ago, when I was 10. We were living in a small village north of here. After she passed, I had nothing. No one. I made my way to the capital, found work in the castle. I've been here ever since. Elder Emiorn's hands trembled slightly, a rare show of emotion from a man known for his stoicism. And your mother's name? Do you remember it? Lyria Silverbond. She never spoke of my father, said it was safer that way. I never understood what she meant. The elder closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing a blow. When he opened them again, there was something like pain in their depths, mixed with wonder and recognition. May I examine the pendant? I give you my word I will return it immediately. Phaneira hesitated, her instinct clearly to refuse. The pendant was precious, irreplaceable, the only piece of her mother she still possessed. But something in the elder's expression, desperation mixed with reverence, made her relent. She carefully removed the necklace, the silver chain sliding through her white hair, and placed it in his weathered palm with obvious reluctance. Emiorn held it close, tracing the symbol etched into the silver with a trembling finger. The symbol was complex, geometric patterns intertwining with what might have been letters in an ancient script, designs that predated the current pack heraldry by generations. His breathing changed, became shallow and quick, his entire body tensing as though he'd been struck. Impossible, he whispered, the word barely audible. Then louder, by the old moon and ancient stars. It's impossible. What is? Círdan demanded, standing now, his patience wearing thin. The elder's dramatics were concerning, and Fenira had gone pale, her eyes wide with dawning fear. The elder looked up at them, his face transformed by emotion. This symbol, he said, his voice shaking, belongs to the Silver Bond line. They were the royal family of the northern reaches before the Great Plague nearly destroyed them 40 years ago. Their territory was vast, their bloodline ancient. When the plague came, it killed thousands, including most of the royal family. The few survivors went into hiding, hunted by rivals who wanted to ensure no claim to the northern reaches could ever resurface. He turned the pendant over, revealing tiny marks on the back, a date and initials too small for most to notice. This was commissioned for the last princess born before the fall. For Lyria, daughter of King Theron and Queen Miara. Your mother, child, was a princess in exile. Which makes you... He couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too enormous. Fenira swayed, and Círdan was at her side instantly, his arm around her waist, steadying her. She stared at the elder as though he'd sprouted wings, her face drained of all color. No, she said, the word barely a breath. That's not possible. My mother was a servant. She died alone in a tiny cottage with nothing to her name but that pendant. She never mentioned royalty or kingdoms or anything beyond getting through each day. There was never talk of... She was protecting you. Emiorn interrupted gently, his voice filled with a compassion that seemed to age him further. The survivors of the plague were systematically hunted. Rivals wanted to ensure the Silver Bond line could make no claim, could never rise again to challenge the territories that had been carved from their lands. Your mother hid you in plain sight, made you anonymous, made you safe. She died to keep you secret, carrying her true identity to the grave so that you might live. The revelation crashed over the hall like a wave. The few nobles who'd remained stopped mid-departure, turned, their expressions transforming from polite disinterest to sharp calculation. Servants who'd been clearing tables froze, dishes forgotten. Even the guards at the doors stood straighter, suddenly aware they were witnessing history. Fenira, the servant girl who cleaned floors and mended sheets, was royalty. Fenira, the nobody who'd been mocked and pitied in equal measure, had a legitimate claim to an entire territory. The northern reaches, left in disputed limbo for 4 decades, had an heir. Círdan saw it all play across their faces. The sudden interest, the political gears turning, the calculation of how this changed alliances and power structures. Already they were reassessing, repositioning, preparing to approach this new piece on the board with appropriate respect and scheming. Women who'd looked through Fenira an hour ago were now studying her with new eyes. Men who'd questioned Círdan's judgment were now seeing political brilliance where they'd assumed foolishness. He wanted to snarl at every single one of them, wanted to throw them all out and slam the doors behind them. They didn't deserve to breathe the same air as her. Instead, he tightened his arm around her waist and addressed the room with the voice he used for commanding armies. "Everyone out," he said, brooking no argument. "Now, this conversation is over." They obeyed, even the elder council. Though Emiorn paused at the door, carefully handing the pendant back to Fenira. His touch was reverent, as though he were handling a religious artifact. "I will research the records," he said quietly. "Verify lineages, confirm dates, but child, I've studied the ancient royal houses my entire life. I would stake my reputation on it. You are Princess Fenira Silverbond, last heir of the northern reaches." He bowed then, a full formal bow reserved for royalty, his forehead nearly touching his knees. "Your Highness." Then he was gone, and they were finally alone in the vast hall, just Círdan and Fenira standing in a space that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too full of implications neither of them had been prepared for. When the door finally closed with a resounding thud, Phaneira pulled away from him, stumbling toward the nearest chair and collapsing into it. She was shaking, tremors running through her entire body. The pendant lay in her lap, the silver gleaming like an accusation. "I need air," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't breathe in here. I can't think." Círdan led her to the gardens without a word, his hand steady at the small of her back, guiding her through corridors that blurred together in her shock. The night was cool, a blessed relief after the stifling heat of the hall, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. The garden was his private sanctuary, a place few were permitted to enter, all ancient trees and carefully tended flowers that bloomed even in the cold season. They walked in silence, the only sounds their footsteps on gravel paths and the distant song of night birds, until they reached the fountain at the garden's heart, water singing its eternal song of stone and flow. Phaneira sank onto the fountain's stone edge, her head in her hands, her white hair falling forward like a curtain, hiding her face. Her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. Círdan knelt before her, not caring that the damp stone would ruin his ceremonial silks. Gently, carefully, he pulled her hands from her face. She resisted at first, but he was patient, and finally she let him see her tears. "This is too much," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "Yesterday I was invisible. Nobody. Just another servant in a castle full of them. Today I'm supposedly descended from kings, heir to lost territories, a political piece on a board I don't even understand how to play. Tomorrow I'll wake up, and this will all be revealed as some cosmic mistake, some terrible mix-up, and I'll go back to scrubbing floors, except now everyone will remember that I dared to dream I was more." Her words tumbled out faster now, panic making them run together. "And the worst part, the absolutely worst part, is that I can see it in their eyes already. The nobles who wouldn't deign to speak to me an hour ago are already calculating how to use me. The women who looked through me like I was furniture are now seeing a rival or an opportunity. And you—" She broke off, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "What about me?" Círdan asked quietly, his thumbs stroking across her knuckles in slow, soothing circles. "You invited me when I was nothing, when there was no political advantage, no strategic benefit. You said you wanted someone genuine, someone who saw you as a man instead of a crown. But now everything's different. Now there's a reason for you to want me, a good reason, a politically brilliant reason. And I'll never know if what I thought I saw between us was real, or if it's all just happy coincidence for you." Her honesty cut him to the core. Not because it was unfair, but because he understood exactly where it came from. He'd seen enough political marriages, enough carefully orchestrated romances designed to benefit territories and strengthen alliances, to know how empty they could be. "Look at me," he said firmly. She did, her eyes bright with unshed tears, reflecting starlight and pain in equal measure. "You want the truth? The complete, unvarnished truth?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Your lineage complicates everything. The Elder Council will push for marriage now. Lords who've been pressuring me to choose a Luna will suddenly be my biggest supporters. The union would be politically brilliant. It would unite territories, strengthen borders, heal old wounds, and create an alliance that would make us nearly untouchable." He watched her face fall, watched hope dim in her eyes, and it nearly broke him. "And I hate it," he continued, his voice fierce now. "I hate that everyone will assume that's why I'm doing this. I hate that our story will be told as political maneuvering instead of what it really is. I hate that they'll say I was clever rather than lucky. Because the truth is, Phaneira, I didn't fall for a princess. I fell for a woman who sang while she worked at midnight, who wasn't afraid to laugh at herself, who looked at a king and saw someone worth speaking to as an equal." He reached up, cupping her face in his calloused hands, forcing her to maintain eye contact. "I invited you to that banquet before I knew about your bloodline. I started seeking out your voice in the hallways weeks before tonight. I made the decision to pursue this, whatever this is, when you were a servant with nothing to offer me but yourself. And that was enough. You were enough. You've always been enough. How can I believe that? She whispered. How can I know it's real when the timing is so convenient? Because I'm telling you, and I've never lied to you. Not once. He took a shaky breath. I've led armies into battle. I've negotiated treaties with enemies who wanted my head on a pike. I've made decisions that determined whether thousands lived or died. But sitting here, trying to convince you that you're more than a political opportunity, might be the most important thing I've ever done. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception, for calculation, for anything that would confirm her worst fears. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy something because fresh tears spilled over, but these seemed different. Softer. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice small. Of all of this, of being a princess, of having responsibilities I don't understand, of people expecting me to be something I'm not. But mostly I'm scared of this, of you, of what I'm starting to feel. What are you feeling? Like I'm falling. Like I've been falling since that night you caught me singing and didn't report me to the head housekeeper for making noise. Like I want this to be real so badly it physically hurts. And if it's not, if this is just politics dressed up as romance, I don't know if I'll recover. Surden's heart clenched at the raw vulnerability in her words. This woman who'd survived alone since age 10, who'd clawed her way through life with nothing but determination and that pendant, was letting him see her fear. It was a gift he didn't take lightly. I can't promise this will be easy, he said honestly. The politics are real. The complications are real. There will be people who use you, who try to manipulate you, who see you as a stepping stone to my favor. The court can be vicious, and you'll need to learn to navigate it. That's not very reassuring. I'm not finished. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air. I can't promise easy, but I can promise real. I can promise that what I feel for you has nothing to do with territories or alliances. I can promise that I'll teach you everything you need to know about being royalty, not because I need a politically advantageous Luna, but because you deserve to claim your heritage. And I can promise that I will be here, beside you, for all of it. Why? The question was almost a sob. Why would you do that? Because I'm falling too, he said simply. Have been since I heard you singing. And I'd rather fall with you than stand safely alone. She kissed him then, sudden and fierce, her hands fisting in his shirt as though she could anchor herself to him. He responded immediately, one hand tangling in her white hair, the other pulling her closer until there was no space between them. The kiss tasted of tears and promise, of fear and courage, of two people choosing each other despite every reason not to. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Phaneira was crying in earnest now, but she was also smiling through the tears. I was falling too, she whispered against his lips. And it terrified me. Still terrifies me. Still terrified? Yes, but less alone in it now. She pulled back slightly, studying his face in the starlight. You really didn't know about my lineage when you invited me? I swear it on my life, on my crown, on everything I hold dear. I invited you because you make me laugh, because you challenge me, because you're kind to people who can do nothing for you, because you're real in a world full of masks. She nodded slowly, accepting his words, choosing to believe. It was an act of courage, he realized, choosing to trust after a lifetime of having nothing to rely on but herself. Okay, she said quietly. Okay? Okay, I believe you, and I want to try. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I want to try. Even knowing how complicated it will be? Especially knowing that, Because if you're willing to face all those complications for me, then I'm brave enough to face them with you." He kissed her again, softer this time, reverent. This woman who'd survived impossible odds, who'd been revealed as lost royalty, who had every reason to be jaded and bitter, was choosing to be brave, was choosing him. They sat by the fountain for hours after that, talking until the moon reached its apex and began its descent. He told her about the pressures of kingship, the loneliness of leadership, the weight of decisions that affected thousands. She told him about life as a servant, about learning to be invisible while still maintaining dignity, about small acts of rebellion like singing while she worked. "What happens now?" she asked, as dawn began painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. "Now we navigate it together. Elder Emiorn will confirm your lineage, which means you'll need to learn your family's history. I'll assign tutors to help you with etiquette, politics, the things you'll need to know. You'll move from the servants' quarters to proper chambers befitting your station." She tensed at that. "I don't want special treatment just because of who my mother was." "It's not special treatment. It's what you're owed. What was stolen from you when your mother had to flee. You can't reclaim your heritage while living in a closet-sized room with 5 other servants." She smiled at that, a real smile that chased some of the exhaustion from her face. "It's not quite closet-sized. More like broom closet-sized." He laughed, the sound surprising both of them. When was the last time he'd laughed like this, unguarded and genuine? "I promise your new chambers will be larger than a broom closet." "Will they have a window?" "I've always wanted a window." The casual mention of something so basic being a dream broke his heart a little. "They'll have several. And a view of the eastern gardens. And a bath large enough to actually lie down in. And staff to help you if you want it, though you can decline their service if it makes you uncomfortable." She was quiet for a moment, processing. "This is really happening, isn't it? My life is changing completely." "Yes, but you don't have to face it alone." She turned to him, her expression serious. "If we do this, if we pursue this connection between us, while I'm learning to be a princess, we need to be honest. About everything. I won't survive court politics if I can't trust you completely." "Agreed. No secrets between us. And we go slowly. I need time to figure out who I am before I can figure out who we are together." "As slow as you need." She held out her hand, formal and binding. "Partners, then, in whatever this becomes." He took her hand, but instead of shaking it, he raised it to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Partners. In the weeks that followed, Elder Emiorn's research confirmed what he'd suspected. Hours spent poring over ancient texts, cross-referencing genealogies, and consulting with historians from 3 territories led to an irrefutable conclusion. Phaneira was indeed the last direct descendant of the Silverbond royal line. The documents were presented to the full council, complete with family trees that traced her lineage back 6 generations, birth records that matched her mother's story, and the pendant itself, which bore markings that only royal jewelers had been permitted to use. The discovery sent shockwaves through the pack hierarchies. Suddenly, the young woman who'd served meals and changed linens was being courted by political factions, offered alliances wrapped in pretty words, treated with a deference that made her deeply uncomfortable. Lords who'd questioned Cerdan's judgment at the banquet now proclaimed it brilliant foresight. Ladies who'd looked through her now invited her to tea, their smiles sharp and calculating. Cerdan watched it all with growing frustration. He saw how she struggled with the sudden shift, how she hated the falseness of those who'd ignored her days before, but now bowed and scraped, how she'd flinch when someone called her "Your Highness" instead of her name, how she'd retreat to her new chambers, overwhelmed by the weight of expectations she'd never asked for. He tried to shield her from the worst of it, but there were protocols he couldn't bypass, traditions that demanded attention. She needed to learn the intricate dance of court politics, had to memorize hundreds of faces and names and alliances. Tutors filled her days with lessons on diplomacy, history, etiquette, economics. She absorbed it all with fierce determination. But he could see the toll it took. One evening, about 3 weeks into her transformation, she came to his private chambers just after sunset. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her shoulders tight with tension. He dismissed his advisors immediately, ignoring their protests about unfinished business. "I want to go back to the kitchens," she said without preamble, collapsing into one of his chairs with none of the grace her etiquette tutor had been drilling into her. "I want to scrub floors and fold linens and be invisible again." "You want to hide," he said gently, pouring her wine from his personal reserve and placing it in her hands. "I want to be real again." She took a long drink, then set the glass aside and buried her face in her hands. "Today I had tea with Lady Morvenna, who spent 20 minutes explaining why her son would be an excellent political match for my particular situation. Then Lady Haverna cornered me in the library and suggested I might want to distance myself from you to avoid appearing too dependent on your favor. Then Lord Thackeray actually had the audacity to ask if I remembered any details about my mother's life that might prove useful in territorial disputes. What did you say to him?" "I told him my mother's life was not a resource to be mined for his benefit." She looked up, and there was fire in her eyes now. He wasn't pleased. Despite everything, Cerdin smiled. "I would imagine not. Thackeray's used to people deferring to him. Well, he can get used to disappointment." He moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. "You're handling this better than you think." "I'm barely handling it at all. I feel like I'm drowning, Cerdin. Every day there's something new to learn, someone new trying to use me, some new expectation I'm failing to meet. And the worst part is, I can see the disappointment in people's eyes when I don't act like the princess they think I should be." He reached out, taking her hand. She gripped it like a lifeline. "You're not failing anything. You're learning a language that took me years to master, and you're doing it in weeks while everyone watches and judges. That's not failure. That's courage. It doesn't feel like courage. It rarely does." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "What if we escaped? Just for an evening. No lessons, no courtiers, no expectations. Just us." She looked at him skeptically. "You're the king. You can't just escape. Watch me." An hour later, they were both dressed in simple, borrowed clothing, unrecognizable as king and lost princess. They slipped out through a servant's entrance Cerdin had used for exactly this purpose before, when the weight of the crown became too much. The city streets were alive with evening activity. Merchants closing their shops, families heading home, taverns filling with workers ending their shifts. Phaneira seemed to transform as they walked. The tension left her shoulders. Her steps became lighter. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled freely. They wandered through the market district, bought cheap meat pies from a street vendor who had no idea he was serving royalty, and ended up sitting on a wall overlooking the river, eating with their hands like common folk. "This is better than any state dinner I've ever attended," Cerdin said, taking another bite of his pie. "That's because you can actually taste the food instead of worrying about using the right fork." She licked grease from her thumb, completely unselfconscious. "Why don't you do this more often? Just be yourself instead of the king." "Being king isn't separate from being myself. It's who I am, for better or worse. But you're right that I don't let myself just exist very often. There's always another crisis, another decision, another person needing something. Do you ever regret it, taking the throne so young?" "Sometimes. When my father died, I was 23 and thought I knew everything. I learned quickly that I knew almost nothing about actually ruling. But regret doesn't change anything. The crown was mine. The responsibility was mine. So I learned." She was quiet for a moment, watching the river flow beneath them, lights from buildings dancing on the dark water. I understand that. The learning part, having to become someone you weren't prepared to be. The difference is, you didn't ask for this. Neither did you. You were born to it, but you didn't choose your father's death. He hadn't thought of it that way before. They sat in companionable silence, finishing their pies, watching the city breathe and live around them. "Thank you," Phaneira said softly. "For this. For reminding me that I'm still a person underneath all the titles and expectations. You're the most real person I've ever known," he said, echoing words he'd spoken before. "Don't let them take that from you." She looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. The fear and uncertainty that had been there since the night of the banquet eased, replaced by something warmer. "I'm starting to understand what you meant," she said, "about seeing you as a man instead of a crown. Because right now, sitting here eating cheap street food and talking about regrets, you're just Gurdon, and I think I like him quite a lot." His heart stuttered in his chest. "Yeah?" "Yeah." She leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "He's kind and patient, and he makes me feel like I'm not facing impossible things alone." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. Something floral from the expensive soaps she now used, mixed with her own unique scent. They stayed like that until full dark. Two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, stealing a moment of peace before returning to their complicated reality. After that night, things between them changed. The careful formality eased into something more comfortable. He began calling her to join his evening walks through the castle grounds, ostensibly to discuss political matters, but really just to talk. She started appearing at his training sessions, watching him spar and offering commentary that made his soldiers laugh and made him work harder to impress her. One morning, about 6 weeks after the banquet, he found her in the library, surrounded by books about the northern reaches. She was taking notes, her white hair falling forward as she bent over an ancient text, completely absorbed. "Learning about your heritage?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. She looked up, and he was struck again by how much she'd changed. She carried herself differently now, with more confidence, though she still had moments of uncertainty. Her clothing was finer, befitting her station, but she'd insisted on simple designs without excessive ornamentation. Trying to. Apparently the Silverbonds were known for their innovations in agriculture and water management. They turned the northern reaches from rocky wasteland into fertile territory through a series of aqueducts and irrigation systems that were considered engineering marvels. "Your ancestors were clever. My ancestors are strangers to me. I'm reading about them like I'd read about any historical figure." She closed the book with a frustrated sigh. "I don't feel connected to them. Am I supposed to? Everyone expects me to feel this surge of recognition or belonging, but all I feel is overwhelmed." He understood that feeling more than she knew. Give it time. Identity isn't instant. It's something you build. Did you feel like a king right away, when your father died? Not even close. I felt like an imposter wearing my father's clothes. It took years before I stopped waiting for someone to call me out as a fraud. She smiled at that. "I can't imagine you ever feeling like a fraud. You're so certain, so confident in everything you do. Only because I've learned to fake it convincingly. Most of leadership is pretending you know what you're doing until you actually do." That's oddly reassuring. They fell into a pattern after that. Study sessions in the library where he'd help her understand political theory, and she'd share what she was learning about her family. Walks through the gardens where they'd debate philosophy and policy. Dinners in his private chambers where they could speak freely without courtiers listening. The elder council noticed, of course. They began making gentle suggestions about formalizing the relationship, about the benefits of an official courtship. Círdan deflected them all. He'd promised Phaneira they'd go at her pace, and he intended to keep that promise even when it frustrated his advisors. "The people are speculating," Bellingham told him one afternoon during a strategy session. "Rumors are spreading that you're courting the lost princess. It would be politically beneficial to confirm or deny. The people can speculate all they want. My private life is not a political tool. With respect, Your Majesty, when you're king, everything is a political tool. Then with equal respect, I'm choosing not to use this particular tool until the lady in question is ready." Bellingham sighed, but didn't push further. He'd learned when arguing with Curdon was pointless. Phaneira, for her part, was aware of the speculation and the pressure. She mentioned it one evening as they walked through the castle grounds, frost crunching under their feet. "They want you to claim me," she said bluntly. "Make me your official consort, or betrothed, or whatever the proper term is. They want a lot of things. Doesn't mean they'll get them. Why are you waiting? The political benefits are obvious. My claim to the northern reaches combined with your territories would create an alliance powerful enough to reshape the entire region." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The moonlight turned her white hair silver, made her pale skin glow. "Is that what you think this is about? Political benefits?" "I don't know what to think anymore. Every conversation I have, every lesson I sit through, people mention how advantageous our union would be. Even people who genuinely like me can't help calculating the benefits. Then let me be clear." He stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of darker blue in her pale eyes. "I'm waiting because I promised you we'd go at your pace, because I want you to be certain, without any doubt, that when I ask you to bind yourself to me, it's because I love you, not because it's politically convenient." Her breath caught. "You love me?" The words had escaped before he'd fully thought them through, but now that they were out, he found he didn't want to take them back. "Yes. I'm fairly certain I've been falling in love with you since I first heard you singing. But I know for certain now. I love how you challenge everyone, including me. I love how you refuse to let your past define your present. I love how kind you are to people who can do nothing for you. I love how you make me laugh when I'm taking myself too seriously. I love you, Phaneira. Not the princess, not the political opportunity. You." She stared at him, eyes wide, lips parted in shock. For a terrible moment, he thought he'd ruined everything by confessing too soon. Then she closed the distance between them and kissed him, with a desperation that stole his breath. When they finally broke apart, she was crying, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I think I have for weeks, but I was too scared to admit it. Too scared that it was too fast or too complicated or too impossible. And now? Now I'm still scared, but I'm more scared of not trying, of letting fear keep me from something that could be extraordinary." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring it. She tasted like courage and hope, and everything he'd been waiting for without realizing it. "We still go at your pace," he murmured. "Love doesn't change that promise." "What if my pace is faster than you think?" She pulled back, looking up at him with an expression that was both shy and bold. "What if I'm ready to make this official? Are you sure? Once we announce a formal courtship, the pressure will intensify. Every move we make will be scrutinized." "I'm sure. Or at least, I'm as sure as I can be about anything. I love you. You love me. We can navigate the rest together." He wanted to argue, to give her more time, to protect her from what was coming. But the certainty in her eyes stopped him. She was making a choice with full knowledge of the consequences. Who was he to deny her that agency? "Okay," he said simply. "We'll announce the courtship tomorrow." She smiled, then laughed, the sound bright and free. "Just like that?" "Just like that. Though I should warn you, once the announcement is made, the entire kingdom will have opinions about our relationship. Let them. I've survived worse than opinions." She had. This woman who'd lost her mother as a child, who'd worked herself to exhaustion for years, who'd discovered royal lineage and embraced it despite fear, was stronger than anyone gave her credit for, including sometimes herself. They stood in the garden until late, talking about the future, making plans, stealing kisses like teenagers instead of royalty. And when he finally escorted her back to her chambers, leaving her at the door with one last lingering kiss, Círdan felt lighter than he had in years. He was in love. And miraculously, impossibly, she loved him back. Their courtship, when announced officially, was met with mixed reactions. Some celebrated the romantic union of king and lost princess. Others grumbled about political convenience. A few questioned whether Rhaenyra was truly ready for the responsibilities of Luna. But Círdan didn't care about the whispers. He cared about the way Rhaenyra challenged him in council meetings, offering perspectives from those who lived outside palace walls. He cared about the mornings she convinced him to skip training to watch the sunrise instead. He cared about the nights they stayed up late debating philosophy and laughing at terrible jokes. She made him better. Not stronger or more strategic, though those things happened too. She made him more human, and he, in turn, gave her the courage to step into her heritage. He was there when she met with the few surviving families from the Silverbond line, when she studied the histories of her people, when she struggled with the weight of a legacy she'd never asked for. He never pushed, never demanded she be anything other than herself. "You're staring again," she said one evening. They were in the library, she reading through ancient texts about her ancestors, he supposedly reviewing territorial reports, but actually just watching her. "You're beautiful when you're concentrating." She looked up, arching an eyebrow. "I'm wearing an old dress, and I haven't brushed my hair in 6 hours." "Still beautiful." She threw a cushion at him, laughing when he caught it effortlessly. "You're impossible." "You love me anyway." "I do," she said softly, and the admission still had the power to make his heart stutter. "Stars help me, I really do." He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. "Then marry me." She blinked. "What?" "Marry me. Not for politics or alliances or anything else. Marry me because we make each other laugh. Because you're the only person who tells me when I'm being an idiot. Because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life." "Círdan, that's not a proper proposal. There's no ceremony. No witnesses, no—" "I don't care about proper. I care about you. About us." He took her hands, his grip firm and sure. "I'll do the formal proposal later if you want, in front of the whole court with all the pomp and tradition. But right now, in this moment, I'm asking you, Rhaenyra Silverbond, will you be my wife?" She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she smiled. Yes. The formal announcement came a week later, delivered in the throne room before the assembled court. Círdan had commissioned a ring, a band of silver and moonstone that caught the light like captured starfire. He presented it on one knee, reciting the traditional words of binding, but his eyes never left Rhaenyra's. The court erupted in applause. Nobles rushed forward to offer congratulations. Plans for the wedding began immediately, a massive celebration that would unite 2 packs, 2 histories, 2 futures. But beneath the joy, darker currents stirred. The Bloodclaw pack, rulers of the Eastern Ridge, had watched the courtship with growing alarm. For years they'd maintained a fragile peace with Círdan's territory, but the alliance Círdan's marriage would create threatened their power. The union of the Ashkristan military, might with the Silverbond ancestral claims, would create a force too powerful to oppose. They couldn't allow it. 3 days before the wedding, intelligence reports reached Círdan's war council. Bloodclaw forces were mobilizing. A messenger had been intercepted carrying orders to attack during the ceremony itself, when defenses would be focused on celebration rather than battle. "We should postpone," one of the generals suggested. "Fortify our positions, Prepare for siege. Círdan stood at the war table, studying the maps with cold calculation. This was the version of him the world knew best. The strategic mind, the ruthless leader, the king who'd earned his throne through conquest and cunning. His fingers traced routes and choke points, identifying weaknesses in enemy formations with practiced ease. "No," he said finally. "We proceed as planned. Your Majesty, the risk." "I'm aware of the risk," his voice carried absolute authority. "But if we show weakness now, if we let them dictate our actions, we invite further aggression. We marry as planned, and when they come, we'll be ready." He dismissed the council, all except his most trusted commanders. Together, they crafted a strategy that would turn the anticipated attack into the Bloodclaw Pack's worst mistake. When Phaneira learned of the threat, she came to him in his war room. He was still bent over maps, planning movements and contingencies. She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward until he had no choice but to meet her eyes. "Tell me the truth," she demanded. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I'm considering locking you in the safest room in the castle during the ceremony. Try it, and I'll never speak to you again." Despite everything, he almost smiled. "I'm trying to protect you." "I don't need protection. I need to know what we're facing." When he hesitated, she continued, her voice softer, but no less firm. "We're partners, Círdan. You can't shut me out of the difficult parts." He exhaled slowly, then began explaining the intelligence, the numbers, the tactical challenges. She listened intently, asking questions that proved she'd been paying attention during all those strategic discussions she'd sat in on. "What if we evacuated the civilians before the ceremony?" she suggested. "Made it look like normal wedding preparations, moving people to witness sites, but actually getting non-combatants to safety?" He stared at her. "That could work. They'd expect panic, chaos. Organized evacuation disguised as celebration planning wouldn't raise alarms." They worked through the night, refining plans, coordinating details. At some point, she fell asleep against his shoulder, exhausted. He carried her to his chambers, laying her carefully on his bed and pulling a blanket over her. She stirred, catching his hand before he could step away. "Stay," she murmured, half asleep. He did, laying beside her fully clothed, her hand clasped in his. Tomorrow they would face war. But tonight, for a few stolen hours, they could have peace. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, mockingly beautiful. Guests began arriving at dawn, packs from across the territories coming to witness the historic union. What they didn't know was that every second guest was actually a soldier in formal dress. Every servant was trained in combat. Every decoration hid a weapon. Phaneira dressed in her chambers, surrounded by attendants who fussed over her gown and hair. The dress was stunning, white silk with silver embroidery that echoed the symbols of her lineage. Her white hair had been woven with tiny moonflowers, creating a crown more beautiful than any metal could provide. She looked like a queen. She felt like she might vomit. "Nervous?" one of the attendants asked kindly. "Terrified," Phaneira admitted. "That's normal. Every bride feels—" "I'm not nervous about the wedding. I'm nervous about the battle that's coming after." The room went silent. The attendants exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to their lady casually discussing warfare on her wedding day. Phaneira stood, smoothing her dress. "How many of you can fight?" 3 hands raised hesitantly. "Good. There are weapons hidden in the third wardrobe. When the attack comes, and it will come, I need you protecting the civilians. Get them to the underground passages. Can you do that?" They nodded, fear mixed with determination in their eyes. "Good. Now finish making me beautiful. I have a king to marry and a pack to help defend." The ceremony was held in the great courtyard, hundreds of witnesses packed into the space. Círdan waited at the altar, magnificent in formal armor polished to mirror brightness. When Phaneira appeared at the far end of the aisle, the crowd gasped. She walked toward him, chin high, every inch a queen. But her eyes were locked on his, and in them he saw not fear, but fierce determination. This was his partner, his equal, his match in every way that mattered. She reached him, placing her hand in his. The officiant began the traditional words, speaking of pack bonds and eternal unions. Círdan barely heard them. He was too focused on Phaneira, on the way she was gripping his hand just a bit too tightly, on the slight elevation of her heartbeat he could hear even over the crowd. I, Círdan Ashcreston, take you, Phaneira Silverbond, as my Luna, my mate, my... The first arrow struck the ground 3 feet from the altar. Chaos erupted instantly. Screams filled the air as Bloodclaw warriors poured through breached walls, weapons drawn. But instead of the panicked mob they'd expected, they found organized resistance. Soldiers dropped their civilian disguises, forming protective lines. Civilians fled in orderly fashion toward prepared escape routes. And at the center of it all, Círdan transformed. The gentle man who'd courted Phaneira vanished, replaced by the warrior king who'd conquered 2 territories before his 30th year. He drew his sword with a sound like thunder, his voice booming across the courtyard. "Protect the civilians! Defensive formations!" He expected Phaneira to flee. Hoped she would, actually, despite her earlier defiance. Instead, she grabbed a fallen sword from a nearby guard, her white dress already splattered with dirt and blood. "Phaneira, get to safety!" "We fight together or not at all!" she shouted back, parrying a blow from an attacking warrior. Something swelled in his chest, pride and terror mixing into an emotion too complex to name. She wasn't a trained fighter, but she had courage and surprising instinct. And she was right. They'd promised to stand together through everything. So he fought beside her. The battle was brutal and swift. The Bloodclaw pack had expected easy prey, a wedding party caught off guard. Instead, they found a trap sprung with lethal precision. Círdan's forces drove them back systematically, cutting off retreat routes, forcing surrender. Through it all, Círdan was a force of nature. He moved through enemies like death incarnate, his sword finding throats and hearts with mechanical efficiency. He was merciless, showing no quarter to those who dared threaten his people, his kingdom, his mate. But whenever Phaneira called his name, whenever she needed him, he was there instantly, protecting, defending, a snarling beast to the world, but her devoted guardian always. She saw both sides of him that day, the ruthless king and the protective partner, and loved him all the more for the duality. When the last enemy finally surrendered, the courtyard was a mess of broken decorations and fallen fighters. Círdan stood at the center, breathing hard, covered in blood, none of it his. His eyes scanned the space frantically until they found Phaneira, still standing, still alive, a cut on her arm but otherwise unharmed. He was at her side in 3 strides, cupping her face, searching for injuries. "I'm okay," she assured him. "Círdan, I'm okay. You fought." His voice was rough with emotion. "You didn't run. I told you, we're partners." He kissed her then, in front of everyone, not caring about the blood or the chaos or the witnesses. Kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning. When they broke apart, the crowd, those who'd remained, those who'd fought, erupted in cheers. They'd witnessed something rare. Their king, invincible and fierce, showing the depth of his devotion. The officiant, remarkably, was still alive and present. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Perhaps we should finish the ceremony?" Laughter rippled through the remaining crowd, tension breaking into something like joy. Círdan and Phaneira returned to the altar, still bloody, still breathing hard, still clasping hands. The officiant spoke the final words quickly, as though afraid of another interruption. "By the power vested in me and witnessed by Pack and Moon, I declare you bound as mates, as Luna and Alpha, as husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." "Already did," Círdan said, grinning. But he kissed her again anyway, softer this time, tender despite the violence that had just passed. The celebration that followed was nothing like the planned festivities. There were wounded to tend, damage to assess, prisoners to secure. But there was also joy, fierce and triumphant. They'd survived. They'd won. And in the process, they'd proven something important. Together, they were unbreakable. The weeks following the attack were consumed with reconstruction and political maneuvering. The Bloodclaw Pack's failed assault had weakened them significantly, leading to internal strife and eventual surrender of their territory. Círdan absorbed their lands, but rather than ruling through conquest, he appointed fair governors and focused on healing rather than domination. Rhaenyra was instrumental in that process. She'd lived as a servant, understood the needs of common people in ways nobles often didn't. She insisted on hospitals, schools, infrastructure for the newly acquired territories. She visited personally, speaking with families, listening to concerns. The people loved her for it. Círdan watched her transform from uncertain servant to confident queen, with something approaching awe. She'd always had the strength, he realized. She'd just needed the space to let it show. One evening, 2 months after their unconventional wedding, they walked in the gardens where he'd first confessed his feelings. The fountain sang its familiar song, stars wheeled overhead, and peace settled over the kingdom like a warm blanket. "I have something to tell you," Rhaenyra said, her voice carrying an odd note. Círdan turned to her, immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Nothing at all." She took his hands, pressing them to her stomach. "I'm pregnant." Time stopped. Círdan stared at her, processing the words. A child. Their child. The continuation of everything they'd built, everything they'd survived. "Say something," she whispered, nervous now. He couldn't speak. His throat had closed around emotions too big for words. Instead, he dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to her stomach, his arms wrapping around her waist. She ran her fingers through his hair, understanding in the gesture everything he couldn't articulate. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. And now she was crying too, joy spilling over in salt and laughter. "Our baby? Can you believe it?" He pulled back enough to look up at her, this woman who'd walked into his life as a joke and become his entire world. "I believe it," he said hoarsely. "I believe in you. In us. In all of this." She pulled him to his feet, and they stood together in the moonlight, her hand on his cheek, his hand on her stomach where their future grew. "It started with a joke," she murmured. "Your friends teasing you about inviting a servant to a royal banquet." "Best joke I ever heard," he replied. "Everything changed when I walked into that hall." "No." He shook his head, brushing a strand of white hair from her face. "Everything changed before that. The moment I first saw you, singing in the corridors, I was already lost. The banquet just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. Lost or found?" He considered the question seriously. "Both. Lost to who I was supposed to be, found by who I was meant to become." They stood there as night deepened. Two people who'd defied expectations and survived war and claimed love against impossible odds. Inside her, a new life grew. A child who would carry both legacies, both bloodlines, both stories. The kingdom stretched out around them, peaceful and prosperous. The pack that had mocked their alpha's choice now celebrated it. The servant girl had become a queen. The lonely king had found his match. And somewhere in the castle, in rooms being prepared for a nursery, the future waited to be born. Círdan pulled Rhaenyra close, tucking her against his chest where she fit perfectly. She sighed, content. her hand finding his over her stomach. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me, even when I was invisible to everyone else." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You were never invisible to me. You were always the brightest thing in every room." She tilted her head back, meeting his eyes in the starlight. What passed between them needed no words, promises kept and promises yet to make, love acknowledged and deepened, a future uncertain but faced together. The moon rose higher, blessing them with silver light. And in that garden where everything had changed, where confessions had been made and hearts opened, Círdan and Fëanira stood as what they'd always been meant to be. Not king and servant, not political alliance, but two souls who'd found each other against all odds and chosen, every day, to keep choosing. The room had fallen silent when she'd walked in all those months ago. But now, standing in the peace they'd built together, the silence was different, not shock or judgment, but the quiet of contentment, the hush of a story told and a future unfolding. And in that silence, they found everything they'd ever needed. Each other. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.